Today on Blue 58, the Packers are through their second roster cutdown. Who's in, who's out, and what does it mean? Let's talk about it. Then, a couple of key position battles will shape the last week of training camp. Let's check in on how things are going on both the offensive and defensive line.
Blue 58!
Hello and welcome to another episode of Blue 58, the one and only podcast of thepowersweep.com. I am your host, John Meerdink. Happy to be with you here for another episode. Got a lot to cover today. Cutdown day has just ended. We've got a second preseason game under our belts, and we've got to talk about Chapter 18 of Blood, Sweat, and Chalk. So let's get right to it. Packers are finished with the second round of cuts. So far, they have released 3 players, traded 1, and put 1 more on injured reserve. Let's start with the guys that they've cut so far. First and foremost, Kamal Martin. We've been saying this has been a possibility since news of his position switch came. Now it is a reality. Boy, how much of a difference a year makes. He was running with the ones at this point last year. Though you got to wonder if that would have been going on, if there were preseason games or things like that, if that would have shaken out the same way. Ultimately, it didn't really come to much fruition during the season because he injured his knee late in training camp and spent most of the early part of the season working his way back from that. It just never really looked natural for him, though. It was not a good fit. He was too raw against the run and didn't really live up to his billing as a coverage linebacker. On top of that, he was hurt when they drafted him, and then he got hurt again in training camp. That's a tough way to make an NFL career. Next up, I feel like we should talk about Daniel Crawford. This is not in order, but it's the next thing I wanted to talk about. Had a tough road to hoe here. A tight end in a very crowded tight end room, an H-back behind a third-round pick, another third-round pick who arguably plays that same role, a guy who was pretty effective in that role last year. I'm talking about DeGuara, Sternberger, and Dominique Daphne in order there. For a guy who isn't a super elite athlete, it's going to be tough to find a role there. And he didn't find one, and now here we are on the outside looking in. Finally, Josh Avery is the third of the 3 guys released. It was basically him, Jack Heflin, Tyler Lancaster, and Willington Prevalon all fighting for probably what amounts to 1 roster spot. If you look ahead of them on the depth chart, you've got Kenny Clark, obviously. You've got Dean Lowry. You've got Kingsley Keke, and you've got 2021 draft pick TJ Slayton. If they keep 6, that would be a big stretch. They're probably going to keep 5, so it really comes down to those 4 guys fighting for 1 spot. Lancaster's got the incumbent boost there. Prevalon is pretty familiar, though he never made it into a game last year. He was on to the 53-man roster from the practice squad a couple times, and Jack Heflin has played pretty well. That leaves Avery on the outside looking in, although that it still is a little bit of a surprise given how athletic he is. He's an elite tester. It just didn't show up on the field. So those are your 3 cuts. Kadar Holman gets the trade. Not the axe. He gets shipped out of town via trade. This one, a little bit of a surprise to me personally. Well, surprising on one hand. He's a 2019 draft pick. He's a phenomenal athlete. He's got good value on special teams, played 165 snaps on special teams in 2020. It kind of just looks like he lost out to an even bigger special teams diehard in Isaac Yiadom. But there's even no guarantee that he's going to make the roster too, so I guess that shows you where Holman was in the pecking order here. And Gutekunst wisely takes the opportunity to get something instead of nothing for a guy that he isn't going to keep around. He is off to Houston for a 7th-round pick. It sounds like not even a conditional pick, which is a great win for the Packers there. Just getting something, again, for nothing. And Kylan Hill is showing this year exactly what you can get in the 7th round. It's not nothing there. And the Packers get something for Holman. Even more interesting, they traded him to Houston. So functionally, you have a 6th-round pick in Kadar Holman going to Houston for Randall Cobb and a 7th-round pick. I don't know how the Packers don't win that hands down. Let's keep trading things to Houston and see what else breaks our way. Finally, Will Redmond has ended up on injured reserve. I'm trying to not be overly joyous about this because of what it means for him personally, but it's been well known on this podcast that Redmond is a bit of a sore spot for me. I do not see the attraction there. He's been fine on special teams, but the Packers seem overly committed to trying to make him into something he's not. And what he is not is your number 3 safety. And team after team after team after team exploited that over the past 2 years. Now here we are. Will Redmond on injured reserve. Since he's gone on injured reserve in the preseason, he cannot come back this season. I think that's just as well. Let's catch up a little bit on preseason game number 2. And just some general training camp stuff as the Packers head into their final week of training camp prior to getting ready for week 1. To me, it was really hard to draw much from this 4th preseason game for a couple reasons. First, we didn't have Jordan Love, so you're not seeing what the Packers would like to see with their quote-unquote number 1 offense, such as it is. Their top preseason offense, I guess. They don't have the guy they would like to have running the show. So that's a big problem there. Beyond that, this team just appears to be so deep and they have so many spots set already. How much are you getting out of this that is going to actually matter for the regular season? It's not going to be a whole lot, just because there's not going to be a whole lot of guys who are actually on the roster playing this year. But I've got 4 takeaways. First, Kurt Benkert looks competent, but is clearly no more than a depth piece. I think you can look real good in the preseason and also look like a guy that you would want nowhere near any significant playing time in the regular season. It would be nice to have a guy like him on the practice squad. I wouldn't sweat over this all that much if I was the Packers. Yep, he's looked pretty good in the preseason, but I wouldn't take it as some big loss if they tried to sneak him through and he ended up elsewhere. Maybe back in Atlanta they need some quarterback help there, and he has some familiarity there. He's been there before. What I'm saying is, if the Packers end up in a situation where Kurt Benkert is a real option, the season is over anyway. Just cash it in, get a high draft pick. Don't worry about it. So I don't want us to get caught up in the 3rd round pick or third quarterback Taysom Hill drama. Kurt Benkert is not Taysom Hill. There are other players like Kurt Benkert out there. You could find another one if you need one. The only thing that you're losing out on is an offseason in your program and a training camp with your team. You can duplicate Kurt Benkert or somebody else sooner or later. And if you get to the point, like I said, where he has to play meaningful snaps in a game anyway, just cash it in. I thought Malik Taylor played much better. Perhaps I overreacted a little bit to the first game. These things happen. But he looked, I thought at least, more in control in this one than he did in the first game. Just looked more confident in his routes, more confident in his catches, reminding us that he has some very, very solid athletic ability and could show some really nice things here over the final week of training camp. I'm also kind of wondering if the Packers might just ride it out at this point. If they're going to keep 7 receivers, why don't they keep their 5 locks? Malik Taylor is their number 6 special teams guy, and then the 7th can be Devin Funchess, and then you've got 6 receivers plus Malik Taylor to play receiver and special teams. If they're going to go that route, I would bet that's probably getting some pretty significant consideration. At this point, you might as well hold Juwan Winfrey out of that final preseason game and see if you can't sneak him through the practice squad. Jack Heflin looks like the real deal. We've talked about that a little bit, really. We'll talk about him a little bit more here in a second. It seems the question isn't whether or not he can play. It's whether he can play more than the other linemen on the roster. The effort is great. He's not a great athlete, but he's a big body. And the effort really makes up, I think, for a lot of that athleticism at the position that he's playing. We'll circle back to Heflin here in a second. Actually, just talk about it right now. He talked to the media today and had some really good things to say. I'm going to play you a long quote here, but I think it's a good one because I'm at the point with Heflin where I'm wondering to myself, how can you not root for a guy like this? Just take a listen on his backstory and how he got to this point.
I started off at Northern Illinois University. Out of high school, I had 0 offers. So I walked on to Northern Illinois, made a career out of that. I mean, got a scholarship in a year there, just through hard work, great staff with Coach Carey. They're at Temple now. And then with the whole COVID thing coming up, got a new staff. Thomas Hammett, they're doing a great job there. coaching their guys up. But with the COVID year, it was going. I heard rumors conference only. Graduating, I wanted to play the big. I mean, being from a small school, you have to play the big teams. So I wanted to play in the big schools, and then going right on the Iowa-Illinois border, I grew up a diehard Hawkeye fan, rooted for them every Saturday. So when I got into the portal and Coach Bell contacted me, it was a done deal. I was just waiting on the offer from Coach Ferentz, and I know exactly where I was when I got the offer from him, and asked him right on the spot, I'm like, is this committable? And he said, yep. So I'm like, all right, Coach, I'm a Hawkeye, let's do it. Just right there, and that's how I ended up at Iowa and had the best year of my life.
Again, how do you not root for a guy like that? Small school, no attention out of high school, get an opportunity just because of the pandemic, really, to say, I want to go try and do something else. I want to try and play at one of those big schools one of these days. You get an opportunity to play for the school that you grew up rooting for, and now you're in the NFL. What a story, and I hope it keeps going for him because he's been a really fun story to watch this preseason, kind of coming out of nowhere. As far as takeaways from the last preseason game, or the previous preseason game, I should say, really not a lot to say on Kylan Hill other than this. This is Kylan Hill's world, and we are just living in it. Nobody else has a shot at the number 3 running back job. It's just a question of whether or not the Packers want to keep 4. Beyond that, he's the guy. Even though Dexter Williams looked good in spurts on Saturday, even though he looked like he had a little bit of juice in the return game, it's over. Shut it down. It's Kylan Hill. He can do it all. He can run. He can catch passes. He can pass block. It's good. It's good stuff. That's all we need to see from Kylan Hill. He got the job, sir. General training camp stuff. We heard from Kevin King today for the first time since the NFC Championship game. Kevin King, boy, he is a complicated man. I don't recall ever having sat down and listened to him talk before. But sitting down today or standing there at the podium at Lambeau Field, he talked for just about 20 minutes, answered just about every question. And it, at least for me, it was hard to not come away liking him a lot more. You still wish he would do a lot more on the field, but I can see why people like him a lot in the building. He seemed really mature. He seemed to have a really good grasp on who he is as a player. He understands he has some shortcomings. But what really jumped out to me was his perspective on his fight for a roster battle with Eric Stokes. He answered several different versions of the question and basically just boiled down to, hey, I'm going to do the best that I can. I know what I can offer. I'm not going to, stop coaching him up. I'm just going to come out here and do my best. This version of it, I think, was the best representation of what he said.
He didn't ask to come here, you know what I'm saying, how that works. He didn't just say, all right, yeah, they need a corner over there, let me come here. You know what I'm saying? And even if that was the case, that's fine. But I have the utmost confidence, in what I can do. I'm going to be one of the top players in this league, and nobody can take that from me. You know what I'm saying? So I just got to do my part, figure out how to make that happen.
Even if he doesn't end up being one of the best players in the league, which I think reasonable people can disagree there. He may say that he wants to be one of the best players in the league. We can say, okay, well, through 3 years, you have shown pretty much that you are not. But good on him for believing that. I mean, if he thinks he can be one of those guys, go out and get it. And if he is not intimidated by a first-round pick at the position that he plays, shoot, I'm not going to tell him that he has to sit there and be sad about it. But good stuff. He didn't own the NFC Championship game situation quite as hard as I think he probably could have, but still, hard to not come away with a little bit, at least, of a different appreciation for Kevin King than I had before. In a bit more of a downer headline, the Packers seem to be pretty concerned about Za'Darius Smith. I told you to keep an eye on this a couple weeks back. Now keep an even closer eye on it because it looks like he may be in doubt for Week 1. The quote from Matt LaFleur, yeah, that's a great question. I'm not quite sure when we'll get Z back. He's injured right now. I know he wants to be out there, but we're going to be smart with him. He's a big-time player for us. Yeah, it's definitely a concern. I concluded that way before going on to say that they weren't sure they were going to have him in the lineup for Week 1. Suddenly, without Zadarius Smith, the edge rusher group looks a lot different because instead of having two solid guys at the top, you've got Rashawn Gary, who has been ascending but not quite there for his first 2 seasons in Green Bay, and Preston Smith, who remains Preston Smith, a big question mark if there ever was one. And then beyond those guys, pretty sparse. Jonathan Garvin, Tipa Naliai, I mean, it's rough beyond that. Maybe Carlo Kemp gets a look, depending what the Packers want to do on their back end. But beyond Gary and Preston Smith, I always forget that Preston, well, I sometimes forget that Preston is his first name, not his last name. But beyond those two, it's a bunch of nobodies. Not to say they aren't talented, physically gifted guys, but this should be a big screaming concern for the Packers heading into Week 1. Jordan Love back at practice, not much to report there, but notable. Hopefully he gets a lot of reps here in the third week of the preseason. Finally, we've talked a little bit about the defensive line. Let's talk about that interior offensive line battle. Continuing on right now, it looks like if you had to rank the 4 contenders in order, at least at the guard spots, it looks like it's Royce Newman, John Runyon Jr., Lucas Patrick, and Ben Braden. But that's a pretty tight group of 4. Patrick gets a little bit of a boost elsewhere because he can step in at center. Braden gets a little bit of a boost elsewhere because he can step in at tackle. But in terms of the pure guards, it looks like it's Newman and Runyon. We talked a little bit about this last week. Packers would be going into Week 1 with 2 rookie starters on their offensive line for the first time since 2006. But if they can make it work, that's 40% of your offensive line set for quite a while, because it's hard to imagine they'll feel worse about these guys as their career goes on if they're willing to start them in Week 1 of their rookie season. It's getting a little bit crowded. It's going to be interesting to see what the Packers do as things come down the pike here, as they try to fit all of these guys onto the roster. And don't forget about Dennis Kelly. He has a part to play here as well. The Packers didn't sign him just to cut him. So that is going to factor in here as well. This is a good problem to have, and we haven't even talked about Cole Van Lannon, another draft pick for the Packers, who is in kind of a similar boat to Newman. Can do a lot of things up front, and Packers like guys that can do a lot of things up front. So we'll see what they do. Before we dive into our book discussion, I wanted to take a second and shout out patrons Mark Walker, JJ, and Dr. Hillbilly. Each of these 3 fine individuals joined our Patreon support this year, and we are grateful to have them around. Thank you for your continued support, and thank you for all that you do to help this show continue running. We've added a new tool, got an iPad for the podcast studio here, and we're using that to play some of the exterior sound that you've heard here, and we're looking to do a lot more of that, definitely going to streamline our editing process. And your support at the Power Sweep, or at patreon.com/thepowersweep, went a long way towards making that happen. And we want to continue to give back to you as well. And part of our relationship with our patrons is we invite you to be in our Discord server, a private chat for everybody who is helping us do what we do here. If you haven't checked that out, I would encourage you to do that. If that sounds of interest to you, again, patreon.com/thepowersweep. Support us at any level, and you will be invited to join us there. We're also looking to ramp up the bonus Patreon content that we do, starting with monthly AMA-style, Ask Me Anything-style mailbags, as well as just looking at some more topics in depth writing-wise. So look forward to that, and look forward to serving you and continuing this relationship with our listeners however we can throughout the 2021 season. All right, Blood, Sweat, and Chalk, Chapter 18. We're continuing the defensive theme here with Tim Layden. He is talking about the Zone Blitz. Overall impression of this chapter, throughout this book, we've talked about how football is about players and not plays, and it's great to talk about plays, but it's even better to have players to run your awesome plays. But this seems like a good example of plays, not players. So Bill Walsh and his West Coast offense are tearing up the NFL. What do? Well, what Dick LeBeau did is didn't sit down and say, all right, how do we get some really good players to counter what Bill Walsh is doing? He started figuring out new ways to use the players he had to slow down this offense. And dropping people essentially randomly into coverage while bringing other people on a blitz from elsewhere, no matter who those players are, that seems like a pretty good way to mess up this short passing, timing-based offense that is the West Coast offense. Dick LeBeau, for what it's worth, has had an absolutely fascinating career. It's over now. He's retired. But if they gave out Hall of Fame enshrinements for lifetime achievements, he'd definitely get in, except he already went in as a player. Had a 13-year NFL career, made 3 Pro Bowls, was second-team All-Pro twice. Then he coached for more than 40 years as a head coach and an assistant, won 2 Super Bowls, doing all that, and is generally regarded as one of the great innovators in the latter part of the 20th century on the defensive side of the football. That is a Hall of Fame career. He shaped the game of football. It's also interesting to note that the Bengals were a year removed of having Paul Brown, Bill Walsh, and Dick LeBeau all on the same staff in Cincinnati. Paul Brown as coach/owner there throughout the 70s and into the 80s. Bill Walsh would have been the offensive coordinator, and Dick LeBeau would have been the defensive coordinator. But Bill Walsh leaves after the 79 season. Dick LeBeau comes in 1980 with Forrest Gregg, of all people. And Paul Brown just continues there for as long as he did his thing. Finally, I love the phrase safe pressure that LeBeau used to describe his defense. What a great description of what the zone defense does. You want to bring pressure in a way where you can get home, but you want to do it in a way that doesn't expose you to all of the things you're scared about as a defense, particularly in this instance, all the things that the West Coast offense does especially well. It's kind of an odd phrase, I'll admit, for a defense built on blitzing. Blitzing sounds like this. Well, it is. It doesn't just sound like it. It is this aggressive, take the fight to them sort of approach, built on a German word for war, a specific kind of war. If you're a German scholar and that's not exactly what it means, I understand that. I'm referring to the Blitzkrieg in World War II. I think you understand what I'm getting at. It means lightning, right? Lightning war. Anyway, built on an aggressive-sounding term, but yet safe and very systematized. It's not just the mad dogs, turning it loose and going after the quarterback. It's cerebral, it's structured, it's systematic, and that is both why it succeeds and why it fails. I think if you looked at Dom Capers' version of this in Green Bay, and we'll talk about Capers here in a second in relation to this chapter, sometimes it was almost overly conservative. It was so complicated that it ended up being simplistic and overly safe, and teams just sat back and picked it apart. They knew where all the pressures were coming from, despite that sophistication, and it just shredded the Packers' defense again and again and again. Speaking of those Packers connections, 2 pretty significant ones. Dick LeBeau, obviously. He coached for the Packers for 1 season, then worked with Forrest Gregg in Cincinnati. Before Gregg ended up in Green Bay as the head coach there, got to wonder what would have happened with the Packers, with Dick LeBeau, with Forrest Gregg, if Gregg had brought LeBeau to Green Bay with him as his defensive coordinator. Just an interesting what-if in Packers history there. And secondly, Dom Capers. He learned and developed the zone blitz both from and with Dick LeBeau, and ended up working in Green Bay. I would strongly recommend heading over to footballxos.com and tracking down Dom Capers' defensive playbook from his time with the Carolina Panthers. It is about the pinnacle example of what a good playbook should look like. It lays out his philosophy. It lays out his expectations for players. It lays out his defense, which is enormously complicated, in ways that are easy to understand. You can find yourself drawing things out of it. Dom Capers, it's going to sound weird to hear this, considering how it ended in Green Bay. Dom Capers is a much better coach than I think a lot of people realize. Just because it didn't always work, just because the game kind of passed him by down the stretch in Green Bay, doesn't take away from the things he did accomplish as a coach in the NFL. Very smart guy. Whenever he talked in Green Bay, I felt like I learned something when I listened to him. And his defense did work pretty well in Green Bay. Of course, he had a lot of elite players to run it, but they went from having those same players and being just okay on defense to having a lot of those same guys and being really, really good in Green Bay. It worked in Green Bay. And if you want to talk about the zone blitz and what it can bring to your team, well, B.J. Rodgers' pick 6 in the NFC Championship game was, at least in part, a zone blitz, because he ends up dropping back into coverage, and Caleb Haney is more than happy to oblige and hit him right between the 9 and the 0 and send the Packers to the Super Bowl. That's all I've got for you on this episode. Appreciate you listening in. I appreciate all your support, both downloaded-wise and financial through Patreon, and just being a bunch of good people to talk Packers with. I'm having a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to going through this season with you, whatever it may bring. If you enjoyed the show, I would encourage you to share it with someone you think would enjoy it as well. That is the number one way we grow, by getting more people involved in downloading the show, listening to what we're doing, and reacting to it. So please do that. Share it whatever way you think your friends would enjoy it the most. If you want to share a podcast link, you can do that. If you want to share a YouTube link, you can do that. If you want to just have me show up outside their house and live read an episode, well, we could talk about that. Maybe check out the Jeff Bezos vanity tier on Patreon, and we'll see if we can work something like that out. But I appreciate everybody who listens, and I appreciate your continued support and work, and appreciate you joining this conversation with me, conversation with me about the Packers, because that ultimately is how all of us, me included, become smarter Packers fans. And as I always say, smarter Packers fans are better Packers fans, and better Packers fans are what we all want to be. I'm your host, John Meerdink. We'll see you next time on Blue 58.